air now. Not on the air like virtually live streaming. We're not doing that, but we are recording now, just FYI. Welcome everybody. This is an ACG on the Historicity of the Exodus. In case you didn't know that already, that's why I wrote it up here on the board for you. I'm not claiming to be the person who wrote the Exodus. I'm just putting my contact information up here in case you want it. My name is Stephen, and my family's been coming to ECC now for about 10 years. We moved to Bloomington about 10 years ago, and I'm on faculty at the university in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. Speech, language, and hearing sciences, not Old Testament theology. So that right there should be a little bit of a red flag. And I emphasize that just because I do think it is worth your while to know kind of where I'm coming from. And it's because I'm the one teaching this class, it's appropriate for you to know what I actually am maybe not the most qualified person to teach about. And the historicity of the Exodus is one of those topics. It's an area of special interest to me, but as an amateur, I try to do my best to dig into stuff accurately. But if we had an actual expert on the history of the Exodus in here, I'm sure the class would be very different. That such a person would have much more information at their fingertips and would know all the ins and outs of the debates and the scholarship much more than I do. So since you're stuck with me, I do like to always let you know where I'm getting my information, who are the actual experts that I'm relying on. And to that end, I like to bring some books, and I'll show those to you right now very briefly. There is, by the way, I have a written document version of today's ACG. I only have one copy of it, though, but I will send it to Dan, and he should be able to put it up on the website if you're interested, or you can email me directly if you'd like a copy of it. And all these books are listed there. Most importantly, I have really benefited from books by a guy named James Hoffmeyer. Here's a couple of them. One of them is called Israel in Egypt. The other one's called Ancient Israel in Sinai. This one is about the Egyptian sojourn and asking the question, what is the evidence in the Bible and outside of the Bible, in archaeology and ancient documentary texts and whatnot? What's the evidence that Israel actually did live in Egypt at one time before the Exodus? If Israel was never in Egypt, then the historicity of the Exodus is sort of, well, there couldn't have been an Exodus if Israel was not in Egypt to begin with. And there are a lot of folks, a lot of highly regarded folks who today think that probably Israel never really was in Egypt, not in the way that the Bible tells us. Okay. Personally, I think I'm convinced that Israel was there. This book, Ancient Israel in Sinai, is, as you can guess, it's about more about the Exodus per se, and evidence within the Bible and outside of the Bible for Israel's time of leaving Egypt and wandering in the deserts of Sinai for 40 years. Same story goes there. A lot of scholars today think that maybe Israel couldn't have actually been there in the Sinai to begin with. We don't have archaeological evidence of a massive camp of a lot of Israelites for 40 years. There's other reasons why people think that maybe the Israelites were just always in Canaan, and so on and so forth. So that book deals with that in some really interesting ways. I also really highly recommend this book by Kenneth Kitchen called On the Reliability of the Old Testament. I should be showing this to the camera too. On the Reliability of the Old Testament. Kitchen, like Hoffmeyer, is a highly regarded archaeologist and Egyptologist, this it's a long book. It's kind of a long slog to get through it, but it's also got just a ton of information, not just about the Exodus, but about the entire Old Testament. It's really nice, and you get to see a lot of I think Kitchen's personality coming through. He's quite cheeky at times, which is fun in an otherwise academic book. I'll just point out one more of these books up here. This is a book called 1177 BC by Eric Klein, The Year Civilization Collapsed. Eric Klein is also a highly regarded archaeologist at George Washington University. Unlike Hoffmeyer, who is an evangelical Christian, and Kitchen, who I believe is an evangelical Christian, unlike the two of them, Klein, I really don't know anything about his faith. I suspect that he, he is a secular scholar, we'll put it that way. Hoffmeyer is clearly an evangelical scholar. He's highly regarded in the secular world. Kitchen, I can't tell from reading his book that he's evangelical. It reads much more like a secular scholar, except apparently he is evangelical, and he is quite favorable toward the Old Testament. Klein simply reads like a secular scholar, and he takes a more negative view about the historicity of a number of events in the Old Testament. This book right here, From Eden to Exile, is an example of this, where he talks about the Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, the Exodus, the Ark of the Covenant, and he largely comes to negative conclusions about how much we know from the archaeological record and how well the archaeological record and the Bible play together. So the reason I bring him up is because this book, 1177, gives some really interesting, broad Mediterranean world context for the time period in which most scholars think the Exodus occurred, if the Exodus did indeed occur. Okay, so if you want some really interesting background reading, this, unlike Hoffmeyer's and Kitchen's books, this is much less technical. It's not that long, and it's still a little bit technical, but it's really interesting. It talks about all sorts of stuff all over the ancient Mediterranean world in this time period. So I recommend those books to you. I've got some others up here, and if you're interested in taking a look at them after we're done, you're welcome to come on up and do that. Hello?
Hello.
Somebody else say hello? The question of the historicity of the Exodus is a really huge question. There are books and books and books upon books upon books that people have written about questions relating to the historicity of the Exodus. There are documentaries, there are TV series, there are all sorts of things. We have exactly 7 weeks for this ACG, and we have, I'm banking on 45 minutes per week. So you can, I did not do the math ahead of time. I'm not going to try to do it in my head right now, but 7 times 45 is not a lot of minutes to try to handle as big a topic as this. Therefore, we are going to rather severely delimit what we are talking about in the next 7 weeks. It's entirely possible that we will simply skip over some of your favorite questions or topics or controversies or narratives in the Bible. We have to skip over things. We can't do it all. And I apologize if you're hoping to come to this ACG and discuss some things, specific things, and we just aren't going to talk about them. That sounded like a near car accident out there. What we are going to talk about is the history of Israel prior to the Exodus. Okay, we're going to talk about how Jacob ended up in Israel with his family. What time period was it likely to be? What was the historical context in that part of the world at that time? Okay, this is really important for establishing when and whether the Egyptian sojourn actually happened. Okay, when were the Israelites actually in Egypt? Who were the pharaohs? When were they enslaved? All of those things are, of course, vital to thinking about the historicity of the leaving of Egypt, the Exodus itself. So we'll talk about the context, the history for how they got there, and what we think was going on in the ancient Near East at that time. We will talk about the date of the Exodus. When did it actually happen? We will talk about the number of people who were involved in the Exodus. Okay, some of the one of the recurring objections to the historicity of the Exodus account. I'm talking about the Exodus, the book, the Exodus, the account of that book of the exiting from Egypt. One of the recurring objections to the historicity of that account, it has to do with the numbers. How many people are actually leaving Egypt? The book of Exodus says something like 600,000. And many people say, well, wait a minute, that can't be right for this reason and that reason and that reason. And it must be exaggerated, it must be fictional or made up. So we're going to deal with that question. How many people were actually there and involved? We'll talk about Egyptian influence on the Israelites. If the Israelites were actually in Egypt for 430 years, you might expect certain aspects of Egyptian culture to show up in Israelite culture at the time of the Exodus and maybe even a little bit later. Okay, for instance, is the name Moses an Egyptian name? Why would he have an Egyptian name if he wasn't in Egypt to begin with? So things like that. We'll talk about a little bit about the route of the Exodus. How did they actually go? Where did they start? And maybe a little bit about where is Mount Sinai. I don't know that we'll get to all of that, but we'll at least try. And we'll talk about the Bible itself and what it has to say about the Exodus. So the Exodus, as you probably are aware, is a really important foundation event for the nation of Israel, for the people of Israel, right? So the Exodus gets talked about and alluded to throughout the Bible, and we'll spend some time thinking about, okay, what does all of that later commentary after the Exodus, what does all that scriptural commentary about the Exodus tell us about the Exodus, and in particular about this question of the historicity of the Exodus? Okay, that took like 15 minutes for me to say, but that's 6 subtopics that we're going to talk about, or I hope we're going to talk about them. We'll see how it actually goes. 45 minutes is not a lot of time, especially when you're as long-winded as I can get. So those are the sorts of things that we're going to talk about. We are not going to talk about the miracles of the Exodus, okay, like the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, the manna, all that stuff. We could talk about those things and what they mean. We could talk about what various people think about the historicity of those events. But personally, I think that at some point, for me personally, at some point, a miracle is just a miracle. Like it cannot be explained by natural means. And so, for instance, some people have suggested that the parting of the Red Sea didn't happen the way that the Bible says. What happened instead was there was a huge volcanic eruption north of Crete, the Santorini volcano, and that caused a tsunami in the Mediterranean, and that caused, and tsunamis have these big waves that go in and out, and the outgoing wave kind of sucked the Red Sea dry long enough for Israel to cross, and then the ingoing wave brought the sea back on top of the Egyptians. Some people have suggested that that's what happened, and there's nothing miraculous about that. It's just a volcano erupted and it happened. Apart from the fact that most people now think that the Santorini volcano actually was like a couple hundred years too early, I think that the parting of the Red Sea is it's a miracle. And I don't see a fruitful approach to explaining it. I'll call it explaining it away based on something that's not miraculous. At some point, as Christians, we have to believe in the miraculous. At the very least, we have the resurrection to deal with, right? And if the resurrection is not a true miracle, if it didn't happen, Paul says, we are the saddest of people, and our faith is in vain. And if the resurrection is a miracle, and if the Exodus is really like the preeminent event in the Bible that looks forward to the resurrection, and I think that's a fair statement. The Exodus is the preeminent event looking forward to the resurrection. If the Exodus says that it was a miracle, then I'm okay with that. So I don't feel like I have as much to say about that. So we're not going to talk about that. Okay. I do think it's important for you to know where I come down on it. I think the miracles did happen and that they were miraculous. But what I would rather do in this ACG is focus on topics that that have clear or clearer interactions with the non-miraculous, with archaeology, with ancient texts, and stuff like that. Honestly, when we have a conversation with somebody who is arguing against the historicity of the Exodus, usually, nowadays anyway, the argument hinges on, or centers on, or pivots on, or turns on, whatever phrase you want. The argument centers on the questions of, the questions that don't rely on the miracles, okay? The sorts of things that we're going to be talking about, where there's archaeological facts that you can bring up and talk about and discuss. So that's what we're going to do, okay? And I think that is important because, well, there's a really big question. Does it actually matter if the Exodus was a historical event or not? Right? Some people have decided it doesn't really matter. There's a very prominent Israeli archaeologist named Israel Finkelstein. I feel like archaeologists have some of the best names of everybody. Israel Finkelstein, a really prominent archaeologist. He doesn't think that the Exodus actually happened, but he also has come to the conclusion that that's okay for him and his family and their faith, for their faith traditions. He sees no problem with separating faith from tradition, and so he can participate in the Passover Seders with his family. He can teach his daughters about the Passover and about those traditions, about the Exodus narratives, and they can sort of live that together as a family. And at the same time, he doesn't think that it's actually historically accurate, and he's come to the conclusion that that's fine. He's not the only one in that position. Many other people think that it doesn't actually work that well. that if the Exodus is not historically true, then that undermines the historicity and the authority of the rest of the Bible. If the Exodus isn't historically true, how can the resurrection be true, for instance? And for a lot of people, when the historicity of the Exodus is undermined, that does some real damage to their faith. Okay, and I think that that's a really important reason why we should talk about the historicity of the Exodus, and in particular because, again, a lot of these questions, a lot of the objections to the historicity of the Exodus have to do with these what appear on the surface, at least, to be paradoxes or contradictions, either within the Bible or between the Bible and the archaeological record and textual history. Okay. I know I'm being extremely long-winded. I'll try to come to the point. I even put headings in my little document here. What will we do in this ACG? Why are we doing this? I've told you about both of those. What about the miracles of the Exodus? We already did that. What are some good books on this topic? We went out of order. We did that earlier. And then finally, okay, but can we come to the point? Which maybe what you're feeling right about now. Can we come to the point? So I want to talk today, I don't want to just talk about setting up what we're going to talk about. I want to talk about something interesting today as well. And let me see if this will erase. It's working. All sort of. That's good enough. How many of you have heard of the Merneptah Stela? The Merneptah Stela. That's two words that you don't see every day, right? A stela, or stele, is a monument in the ancient world. It's often made of stone. It's often inscribed upon. Okay? Usually it's taller than it is wide. It may be this tall and this wide, and have a bunch of inscriptions on it on the front, maybe on the back as well. It could be bigger. It could be smaller, but it's a monument, so it's not too small, and it often is made of stone and inscribed. Something is inscribed on it, something telling us about what it's a monument to. We do the same thing with our monuments today, right? They're often made of stone. They often have inscriptions on them telling us what it's about. That is what a stela is. Merneptah, which is this is technical, but you have to know it in case you want to go look it up for yourselves. Sometimes it's spelled Merenptah. But Merneptah is easier to say, so I'm going to go with Merneptah. Merneptah was a pharaoh of Egypt. He was the pharaoh between 1213 and 1203 BC. Okay, so that's just a little bit before 1177 BC. Merneptah was pharaoh between 1213 and 1203 BC, about 10 years. He was probably the son of Ramesses II. He certainly was the successor to Ramesses II. And if he was a son of Ramesses II, that means he was also a grandson of Seti I. And how many of you are familiar with the Charlton Heston movie, The Ten Commandments, by Cecil B. DeMille? Yeah. Seti and Ramesses are the two pharaohs depicted in that movie. Just because Charlton Heston plays in that movie, it doesn't mean that that's how it happened. Okay. I was once in a Sunday school class when I was in college. I was an exchange student in Germany, and I went to an English-speaking church over there, and we were talking about the Exodus, and somebody in the room said that the way they found out that Moses was a Hebrew was because they found the cloth that he was wrapped in. And it turns out that the Bible doesn't say that, but the movie does. So anyway, the fun little aside. It is a great movie, by the way, in my opinion. Merneptah was the successor to Ramesses II. Okay. In 1896, I mentioned that the archaeologists have the best names. An archaeologist named Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Yeah, Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Isn't that a great name? He was an early archaeologist. 125 years ago, like almost to the day, he discovered the Merneptah Stela at Thebes in Egypt. The Merneptah Stela is a stone monument. It has inscriptions on it. And it tells about the military campaigns and victories of Pharaoh Merneptah. Most of it has to do with Libya, but at the end, it gets a little bit more interesting for our purposes. And it says this. Obviously, this is not my own translation. I'm borrowing this. And when you get a copy of this, you'll see where I got it from. The foreign chieftains lie prostrate, saying, "Peace!" Not one lifts his head among the 9 bows. Don't know what that means, but it's okay. Libya is captured, while Hatti is pacified. Hatti would be the Hittite Empire based in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Canaan is plundered. Ashkelon, one of the Philistine cities, is carried off. And Gezer, another city in the area, is captured. Yanoam is made into non-existence. We don't know where Yanoam is. Israel is wasted. Its seed is not. And Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. Apparently we know what Huru is, but I don't know what Huru is. All lands united themselves in peace. Those who went about are subdued by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Merneptah. Okay? Did you catch the one key word that I emphasized? Israel. Israel is mentioned in the Merneptah Stele. This is the oldest, it is the earliest, it is the first mention of an entity called Israel that we know about. And because of that, the Merneptah Stele is really important for thinking about the historicity of the Exodus. Okay? We don't have any other records, archaeological or textual, outside of the Bible that recognize a group of people called Israel from this early. Okay? The stela itself dates from the year 1209. And I apologize if you can't see this very well. I guess I can move this. This isn't actually performing any function like I thought it would. Okay? So the Merneptah stela is really important. I want to point out 5 particularly interesting aspects of this inscription. I already pointed out one of them. The inscription itself is from the 5th year of Merneptah, which is 1209 BC. And I won't explain why these are interesting just yet. Just hold it in your memory that we've got these 5 interesting facts. It's dated to 1209 BC. Number 2, it's written in hieroglyphics, right? The hieroglyphic word that is used to spell out Israel, the way that they spell it out indicates that Israel is a foreign people group, an ethnic people group. Every other name in the list is written out in a way that indicates a territory, or a land, or a kingdom, or a place with cities. Okay? Israel is treated differently in the stele. It's a people group. Number 3, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know the location of Yenoam. Yenoam is mentioned just before Israel in the stela. Number 4, apart from Yenoam, which we don't know where it is, the sequence of place names, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yenoam, Israel, the sequence of place names appears to be organized from close to Egypt to far from Egypt. It's as if you could start in Egypt and you could start walking to the east, and you could say, oh, yeah, I'm Merneptah, I'm campaigning in Canaan, and yes, I passed by Ashkelon, and then I passed by Gezer, and then I didn't just pass by, I laid waste to Yenoam, and then I laid waste to Israel before I went back home. That's kind of what it looks like. Therefore, this is still number 4. Therefore, Yenoam seems like it probably should be located between Gezer and Israel. Okay, if that sequence is actually geographical. Number 5. Although most scholars have therefore looked for Yenoam in the hill country of Ephraim, Yenoam probably is actually east of the Jordan River. If you go to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and you go east just a little ways, you come to a place called, in modern times, Tel Esh-Shihab. A tel is a ruin or a mound, so it's a buried ancient city that you can still see evidence of. Tel Esh-Shihab, for a variety of reasons, mostly textual. We have letters, copies of letters written on stone, I think, or clay. Letters between people in Canaan and Syria and people in Egypt. We have some archaeological findings, like miniature stelas, for instance, in this place, Tel Esh-Shihab. All of these textual and a little bit of archaeological evidence suggest that Yenoam is actually on the east side of the Jordan, which would mean if we've got a geographical sequence, Israel has to be on the east side of the Jordan as well. Okay? Altogether, these 5 particularly interesting and I know rather technical details, facts about the stela, suggest that Israel, or part of Israel at least, was a known entity by 1209, but it was an entity that did not have established land boundaries yet. And it was on the east side of the Jordan in the area of Gilead. Okay? Now, the area of Gilead actually was settled by Israelites. The tribes on the other side of the Jordan included Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh. They were on the east side of the Jordan. Fun fact, it is possible that the Bible itself actually refers to Merneptah's campaign in Canaan and against Israel. Okay? You haven't read the name Merneptah in the Bible, but in Judges 10:11, if you have a Bible, I'll let you open up to that before I continue. Judges 10:11. This is part of the Jephthah narrative. Jephthah the judge. Jephthah is a Gileadite. He's from Gilead. And Judges 10:11 says, "And the Lord said to the people," I don't remember if this is starting at the beginning of verse 11. It might be in the middle. "And the Lord said to the people of Israel, Did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and the Ammonites and from the Philistines?" Right? Okay, he's telling the people of Israel, did I not save you before? I'm going to save you again. Okay? This is happening in Gilead, and God is speaking to the people, reminding them of a time when he saved them from Egypt and other people. Usually this is understood as talking about the Exodus, referring to the Exodus. I saved you from Egypt. I brought you out from Egypt. There's a recent proposal, which is in one of these books over here, that I think is interesting and worth considering. We don't know if it's true, but it seems like a reasonable possibility. There are 9 references to Egypt in the book of Judges. All of them are explicitly set in the context of the Exodus, except this one. So, for instance, Judges 2:1, I brought you up from Egypt. Judges 2:12, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. Judges 6:8, I led you up from Egypt. Judges 6:9, I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians. That's in the same context as the earlier, I led you up from Egypt. Judges 6:13, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? 11:13, because Israel, on coming up from Egypt, did stuff. Judges 11:16, 3 verses later. But when they came up from Egypt, they did stuff. Judges 19:30, from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt. That's 8 references to Egypt right there in the book of Judges. All of them are explicitly about the Exodus. But then we have this other one, which happens to be the one that takes place in the context of Gilead. We have a reference to Egypt here that does not explicitly refer to the Exodus. And so it has been suggested that this actually might be a reference to Merneptah's campaign in Canaan. It's the right time period. It's the period of the judges. If you know him, is actually at Tel Shihab. And if the list of names in the stela is actually in order geographically, then it should be in Gilead. And otherwise, why is this the exception to the references to Egypt in the book of Judges? It's the only one that doesn't refer specifically to the Exodus. It seems to refer, perhaps, to another encounter with Egypt. Okay. Now, Judges 10:11 says that God saved the people from Egypt. Merneptah says that he laid Israel waste. Okay. That's sort of a different kettle of fish. Merneptah is probably exaggerating in a lot of ways. Also, whatever Merneptah did, if he won a battle victory over Israel, he did not become a permanent presence oppressing the people of Israel. And in the Judges period, in the book of Judges, most of the focus is on the ways that God delivered the people from longer-term oppression from their enemies around them. So I think there's ways to make that work, but it is an issue. Here's another fun fact, and this is one I came up with all on my own. I'm quite proud of this one. I mentioned that Merneptah's stela refers to Israel as a people group, not as a territory or a land. It turns out that this is actually mirrored in the language that the Bible uses to refer to Israel. And in particular, if you do a search for the phrases people of Israel, and you do a search for the phrase land of Israel, people of Israel, land of Israel, I can show you sort of what the graphs look like. It's very small. I apologize. I'll send it all to you. People of Israel is up here. You can see a lot of big circles on this side and a lot of smaller circles over here. The big circles are relatively high and the smaller circles are relatively low in this top graph. That's because references to the people of Israel happen a lot in Exodus through Judges. And references to the people of Israel happen much less frequently in all of the rest of the Old Testament. In contrast, this one down here is for the land of Israel. There's no mentions of the land of Israel or the lands of Israel or the cities of Israel. No mention in the first 7 books of the Bible. No mention in Ruth, but then in 1 Samuel, right when the monarchy is getting started, that's where these references to the land of Israel start to pop up. And they happen quite a bit in the historical books, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. They happen a lot in Ezekiel. They don't happen a lot elsewhere. Elsewhere, it changes to the house of Israel in a lot of places. Okay, so the next section on my handout says, okay, wait, what was the point? To summarize, we have here archaeological data, the Merneptah Stela. We have some textual data helping us to locate the likely position of Yanoam. We have biblical data that references to Egypt in Judges, references to the people or the land of Israel. We have these 3 different lines of evidence that interact with each other in, I think, some pretty interesting ways. I hope that you have thought this is kind of interesting stuff. The Merneptah Stela is a really important piece of the archaeological record. We will talk more about it next time. Okay, that's one of the reasons I'm highlighting it today. The Merneptah Stela was discovered about 125 years ago. It was a fantastic find. And it appears that the account of Merneptah's campaign here in his victory stela can dovetail really nicely with the biblical account of the Judges period. Okay. I want to emphasize that we have not proven that that's actually the true connection. Okay? Judges 10:11 maybe doesn't refer to Merneptah's campaign. It might. It's reasonable that it could, but we don't know for sure that it does. Yanoam probably is in Gilead, and that would place Merneptah's Israel in Gilead. But we don't know that for sure. We have not proven that. Archaeologists haven't proven that, and we certainly haven't proven that. We don't actually know for sure that the sequence of names is a geographical sequence. It's reasonable to think that way. A lot of Egyptian itineraries like that are geographically sequenced, but we don't know that that's actually what's going on. And that graph, the paragraphs that I showed you, it's kind of fun, but how significant is that really? We don't know. And if I'm now leaving you feeling kind of flat because like, oh, well, we actually don't know anything, and blah, blah, blah. That's how a lot of this ACD is going to go. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. Whatever we may think, or however we may be persuaded or convinced by evidence in favor or against the historicity of the Exodus, again, I'm persuaded in favor of it, but whatever we may think about it, we don't have proof. And one of the reasons that the question of the historicity of the Exodus is such an important, enduring question is because there's not a lot of evidence for it outside of the Bible. And in fact, this is one of the main reasons overall that people object to the historicity of it. If the Exodus really is history, why don't the Egyptians mention it? Why don't the Hittites mention it? Why don't we find footprints of Israelites in the sands of Sinai? Why don't, where is the evidence? We don't have that kind of evidence. Okay, and throughout the next 7 weeks, next 6 weeks, that's a reality that we're going to bump up against quite a lot. The extra biblical evidence for these things is not there. Not direct evidence. So instead, what we have to do is we have to think about indirect evidence, circumstantial evidence, the body of evidence such as it is. What does it say? What can we glean from it? What is a reasonable conviction about the truth, about the historicity of the Exodus? Okay? And ultimately, then, if we want to engage with friends or colleagues who have objections or doubts about the historicity of the Exodus and therefore about the rest of the Bible, a lot of those objections are going to come down to questions about evidence outside of the Bible. And I hope that in the next 7 weeks we'll get a lot of interesting tools for thinking about and discussing what that evidence outside of the Bible actually is and how it plays with the evidence inside the Bible. Okay? So it is, let me see here. One last thing. Merneptah Stele, I said this earlier, well, I'll emphasize it one more time. Merneptah Stele, 1209 BC. This tells us that the Exodus, if it happened, had to have happened before 1209 BC. That's a really important time point. Okay. We will talk more about the date of the Exodus. That will be our topic for next time. And it's already just about 11 o'clock, so I'm going to call that almost perfect timing, a little bit late. I apologize. And thank you very much. Class dismissed, I guess? Yeah. If anyone wants to stick around and chat a little bit, I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to the service. But if you're going to the service now, thanks for stopping by. I'll turn the recording off.